welcome everybody to the Truthful Hope podcast. My name is Jacob Vazquez. I'm the founder of Truthful Hope, and I have the privilege of speaking with a friend of mine and also the youth pastor at the local church that I attend in Delaware, and that's Pastor Lucas Stearns. Lucas, thank you so much for joining and taking the time to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm just glad to be here. I'm just happy that I can be a part and just add whatever it is that I can add. But I am in no way an expert. That's all you. So
No, I'm excited for our conversation, and actually, that's a great segue. Before I kick it over to you to, give an intro about yourself, your testimony, maybe just a brief
yeah,
testimony, and then how you came to be a youth pastor. I do want to emphasize for our listeners the importance of this episode. I really do believe that this topic that we're going to talk about is one of, if not the most important topics to talk about, and that is the spiritual state of the next
hmm
generation. At Truthful Hope, we firmly believe that the most important generation is the next generation.
absolutely.
And, unfortunately, the next generation, the data shows, are increasingly hopeless, increasingly fearful. And it doesn't seem to be a coincidence to me that the rate of self-professing Christians have a lack of a biblical worldview. So I'm just going to read these stats off just to give even more emphasis. According to the American Worldview Inventory 2025 study conducted by Dr. George Barna from the Cultural Research Center, only 4% of U.S. adults who identify as Christians. So here you got people saying, I'm a Christian, I believe in Christianity. 4% of them hold to a biblical worldview, with the rest primarily holding to a syncretic worldview. So it's like a mix of beliefs. I got some Hinduism, I got some Buddhism, I got Christianity. It's all just one bag.
hmm
It unfortunately gets worse. In a 2022 study, also by the American Worldview Inventory by Dr. George Barna, they found that 37% of Christian pastors had a biblical worldview, and only 12% of youth pastors have a biblical worldview. So before I go any further, Lucas, I want to congratulate you for making the minority.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
It's an unfortunate accomplishment in
Yeah.
today's world. But and I do want to clarify, this is how Barna defines a biblical worldview, because that was my first question, right? Was like,
Yeah,
how
it
do you
is huge.
define a biblical worldview? And it's pretty straightforward. He says this: a biblical worldview is believing that absolute moral truth exists. The Bible is totally accurate in all the principles it teaches. Satan is considered to be a real being or force, not merely symbolic. A person cannot earn their way into heaven by trying to be good or do good works. Jesus Christ lived a sinless life on earth, and God is the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the world who still rules the universe today.
That's it.
That's the biblical
That's it.
worldview, and this is this is what people are rejecting at
hmm
the vast majority. Now, as I mentioned, there also seems to be this lack of um, biblical worldview, and also this increase of hopelessness and
hmm
despair. And at Truthful Hope, our mission is to reach the hopeless with the one true living hope that is Christ in 1 Peter 3. But we have to know how to reach them, right? We can't
hmm
just go out and say, repent and believe, and they're going to drop to their knees. We have to understand the trends, how to reach them effectively.
Yeah.
And you have done, I mean, we've spoken a lot about this a couple of weeks ago, I think, that you've done a great amount of research into some of these trends. So I'm
Yeah.
really excited to break this down with you and hopefully uncover some ways that not only we can be aware to raise and cultivate the next generation and disciple them, but also brainstorm some call to actions, right? Maybe we could come up with some ideas.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely. I think that'd
yeah,
be
so
great.
I think this is going to be a great episode, but I do want to kick it off to you. Introduce yourself to our listeners. Maybe give a brief testimony so they can get to know
Yeah.
who you are.
Yeah. So, hey everybody, my name is Lucas Stearns. I'm like Jake said, I am the youth pastor at our church here in Delaware, and I grew up. I didn't grow up in a. I wouldn't say I didn't grow up in a Christian household. I didn't grow up in a household that really was vocal about anything. You know, I had great parents. Still have great parents. And I have a great family. I was raised well. I was taken care of well. My parents were good moral people, which we can get into that in a little bit, because I think that also plays into this larger conversation that we're going to be having. But we just never went to church. We didn't go to church on Christmas or Easter. It was just never a conversation we had. Church was never a dirty word or anything bad. We just didn't participate. It was just wasn't something that was part of our family dynamic. And I grew up a good kid. I wouldn't, whatever you want to say, a good kid. I didn't get in trouble. I had good grades in school. I had good friends and good friendships. But I think around middle school, there was always just like, I was a very anxious kid. I was the type of student who just had a lot of questions just about life and about the world. And I remember just growing up very, aware of the fact that there has to be more out there. There has to be an answer to life. There has to be a reason why we're here. There has to be more to this life than to just live it and get to the end of it. And I just remember, there were days and nights where I would just be so like afraid and just like, hey, why am I here? What happens when we're gone? And asking my parents these questions, and like, we don't have an answer for you. And I would like be so afraid of the unknown and the future and the unseen and all of those things, that it led me to like wanting to find answers. And so when I was in seventh grade, my friend invited me out to a youth night at our local church, and I got hooked. I was like, oh, this is so fun, this is so great, and really wasn't on board quite yet, but I remember being locked in and just attentive to all of the things that were said in the messages. And probably 4 months into that, gave my life to Christ. And ever since then, it was like I had found the answer to like the question that I had been asking, that there's something else, there's this hole, there's this void, there's got to be more out there. And through a relationship with Jesus, have been able to like fill those gaps and be like, okay, this explains, the Bible begins to explain everything that I felt like I was lacking inside of me, like at a soul level and at a heart and spiritual level. And so being able to like jump into that and go all in, and then being able to serve. And I play guitar, so I joined the worship team, and just the whole time just growing in my knowledge of who God is and who He is to me and in my life. And I think as I got older, my whole life, all I ever wanted to do was I wanted to be Tom Cruise. I wanted to be Tom Cruise in Top Gun. My dad was Air Force, so I always grew up around planes. I wanted to fly planes. I wanted to fly them fast and loud and heavy. Like I wanted to, you know what I mean? Like that's what I wanted to do. But the more, yeah, exactly. And so the more I, served and was participating in youth ministry and just doing things in ministry, it became this very natural thing where, I think some people have a moment where, they have like this call from God, and it's like this moment that is like defining for them. And they're like, that was the moment I heard God speak to me. I heard that happen. I didn't have one of those moments. And I think that's okay, because I think there's a lot of people who don't have that, and they feel bad for it, and I think for some people there's a moment of revelation for a calling. And I think for other people, God takes them on this journey of discovery of their calling. And so I think that's kind of my story, is that just over time of serving and loving people and doing what I do now and learning to do better at it, it kind of became this natural thing where it's like, no, maybe this is where God has me, or maybe this is what God has for me. And I think I've always had a natural pull to students and the next generation. At least up to this point in my life, I have. I can relate to them. I get along with them well. I can speak their language, which for some people is like a superpower. They're like that. That alone is qualification for the job. But at the end of the day, I think it's an understanding that student ministry is what changed my life, and so I want to be able to do that for other people. That knowing that so many different people make that decision. I think I don't know when the study's from, but it says like 80% of people will make the decision to follow Christ before the age of 18, before they graduate high school. And I remember like that just stuck with me, of like, oh wow, this is the mission field. Like, and not to downplay what Sunday morning is for so many people, because as we know, life change happens like in that context every single week. But that like at the, I don't, and that's an older quote, so I'm sure the number is probably different now. now. Maybe the same. I don't know, to be honest. I'm sure Barna has a recent study on it. I love Barna's research,
Arn is the
but
man.
Barna's the man. But
Yeah.
I actually have something, Barna, that I want to talk about that has to go with off of what you were actually talking about. But we'll get into it. But yeah,
Yeah.
and so that for me was kind of like a marking thing of like, oh, this is the mission field, and if this is what changed my life, I know that I can stand in the gap and be a vessel to help change other people's life, and to be able to hopefully, and my goal is I want the next generation to do better than my generation did. I want the next generation to surpass me. I want the next generation to surpass you, and to be standing on the shoulders of what they would say is giants, but so that they can reach further, that they can reach faster, that they can reach better and more effectively, and with greater love and grace and truth than what we do. You know what I mean? And so, uh, that's a little bit of my background and testimony, and even how I got into this position, and how I am where I am today.
I love it. And it's actually funny you brought that up. I was going to ask you when you were talking about your testimony, what was it that, you know, flip the switch, for
Mm-hmm.
instance? You said you were part of the youth group, but then you eventually turned a leaf and you committed, and you answered that, right? You said it was just kind of happened. It wasn't like a Damascus Road, kind of
Right.
event. I relate to that wholeheartedly. I'm similar. I don't have, a single moment where I could look back to and say, oh, yeah, that message, that got me. I was a Christian then.
Mm-hmm.
I was more on the skeptic side. I had a lot of questions. I also was kept up at night by, the problem of death, what happens after we
Yep.
die. But I had so much doubt, and I just
Yep. Me too.
at one point found myself like, well, this is true, so
Yeah.
we're obligated to
Yep.
believe it.
Yeah, and I remember like I would just stay up at night and cry because I was like, I mean, like it sounds very like heavy and morbid, but like the fear of death like led me to like Christ, because I was like, nobody makes it out alive. You know what I mean? Like nobody's getting to the end of this life alive, and so, but I remember it would just keep me up at night, and like, just all the questions that come with it. And so, like you said, so much doubt. But it led me to a place where I was like, there has to be more. There must be more to this life. And led me to, coming to church, and, just showing up with my friend and going, let me give this a shot. And looking back, it was the greatest decision I ever made, was to just give it a shot.
It's so good. Yeah, well, um, being part of the local church, I can tell you that we're grateful to have you, and it's
Yeah.
you want to make sure you have shepherds who are knowledgeable in the faith, but that have a biblical worldview. And I think
Yeah.
the issue with so many people, and you said this, you said the mission field, I'm just trying to quote you correctly, is
Yeah.
the next generation. uh, I think you're totally right on that. I think
Yeah.
that alone is a strong statement, but I think it's accurate because if you have the younger generation not having a biblical worldview, they turn into that 37 they well, what's 100 minus 37,
Yeah.
whatever that is.
63%. Yeah.
63% of not having a biblical worldview, right? And then you have
Hmm.
the 12% of youth pastors, or that have the biblical world. So you have that difference, but it all starts from the youth, and they grow up to
Yeah.
raise these kids. And what do you have at the end? You have the low hanging fruit. You have
Yep.
only 4% of
Right.
Christians. And the problem to me is that they're professing Christianity. So that makes it
Hmm.
very hard to go out and shepherd accordingly. So that's why I
Right.
think this conversation is so important.
Yep.
So we know not only how to identify a Christian, but also how to reach them and effectively encourage them to be a Christian.
Yeah. Because the other thing turns around, and it's, if there's only 4% that are professing this, but the rest are professing, hey, I believe, you know what I mean, professing Christianity, but only 4% are living this, or however the breakdown is. You have that whole percentage in between, um, who are professing Christianity and then going in, living and affirming and believing completely contrary to what it is that they claim. Which is dangerous for those who don't believe, and it's also dangerous for those who are looking at us for to be the example, looking at Christians and looking at followers of Jesus and saying, you guys need to set the tone and set the stage, and that's the manner of life that we're leading. It becomes very difficult.
Right, and that's so interesting you said that. It just sparked a thought in my mind. It's like if you have 96% of, let's say, these are
Hmm.
the those that don't have a biblical worldview but profess Christianity, and
Yep.
they're affirming LGBTQ just outwardly, and they're saying I'm a Christian, I'm LGBTQ. Then you have the 4% who are biblically accurate in their worldview, saying no, marriage is between a man and a woman. What people are going to say, oh, well, you 4% are hypocrites because
Right.
the rest of you guys are saying that it's okay, when really it's the other way around. And that's
Right.
just like the classic genetic fallacy.
Yep.
Truth is not determined by who or whom it comes from.
Yep.
It's by what it is.
And what it ends up doing is you end up creating this like vacuum where um, now you allow other we almost in a way it almost allows Christians to not carry a truth mindset. It's all grace. And so it's like trying to find that balance between grace and truth, you know what I mean? Like the hey, neither do I condemn you, and then the truth part of go and sin no more. It's like and I think a lot of that the people with that worldview get hung up on that part because it's like, well, how can I say that I disagree without affirming? And it's like you can love people without affirming their actions. You know what I mean? You can love a soul and a spirit because they're a person worth value. In the eyes of God, and because they're worthy of that. You know what I mean? But you don't affirm the behavior and the mindset and the worldview. And so it's like trying to teach them how do you carry that mindset of grace and truth. You know what I mean? You need both. And I think where we have been with previous generations is super heavy on the truth. You know what I mean? And that's where you see a lot of people with picket fences and like and I think a lot of those generations and a lot of that time in the history of the church has been very good at telling everybody what they're against. Um, and now in the new generation, we see it almost swing too far to the other side, where it's all grace and now there is no truth. Everything's subjective and everything is up for debate. And well, do we really know that that's what God meant when He said that? And a lot of this confusion around it, and we have kind of forfeited truth in the name of grace. And so getting us to a point where we hold grace and truth at equal value, and learn to lead people from that place. So.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, love is not enablement. I think love is one of
Exactly.
those words that's
Exactly.
just been twisted and twisted, and love
Hmm.
is not enablement. And having a child, I think it's brought it to more reality than ever before. I
Yeah.
love her with all my heart, but I'm not going to let her go run wild when I know the right thing, what the right thing to do is.
Right.
So I'm going to tell her, even if she doesn't like it, and that's okay because it's for her.
Hmm.
It's for her good.
Yeah. And
Um,
I know I've kind of been dancing around this. So here, let me I think I have a way of kind of explaining how we get here. We talk about worldview, and I think I have a little bit of like a roadmap, if you don't mind me. I'm going to
yeah,
try and keep it brief.
no, go ahead.
I get really excited about this stuff. I'm not an expert. I'm by no means an expert on like generational studies. You know what I mean? The idea of generational studies is kind of like a made up thing in a way. Like nobody knew what a generation was until like 20 years ago. Then we're like everything's a generation. So
Right.
um, it's still very new, the whole idea of generations, and I think we've learned a lot and a lot has changed, and it's just something I get excited looking at. But I think when we dive into it, we can begin to see how we got from the America then to the America now, where we were wrong before, where we're wrong now, and just how we get here.
Yeah.
Because I think if we don't think about it too much, we probably think that everybody has a similar worldview, or that it's just the way people look at things or view things that creates our worldview. But what we see through the generations is that there were marking moments. There's marking factors and world events and local events and just things that were happening with the times that affected the way that they perceived the world, the way that they perceived ethical and moral values. And we can really take a look at the generations and see how we got to the place that we're at. And so I think if we look back at, what would be Gen X. So these would be people born in like 1965 to 1980, right? You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. And there's a lot of research too about these like cusp generations, which is where I get real excited that there's like almost like when the generations begin to shift, there's like 3 years on either side where there's like the people who are born in that amount of time were kind of like, I don't feel like I fit in anywhere. I feel like I'm kind of in between. But for the most part, we used to define generations as just a gap of 20 years. So every 20 years would be a new generation. But if you looked at somebody who was born in the year 2000 and you looked at somebody who was born in 1981, you could obviously see that they were raised very different. The world around them was very different, and the way they perceive the world around them and it's shaped their ethics and their belief is very different. And so now we see that kind of like the brackets are kind of floating. Some are with bigger gaps, some are with shorter gaps. What we're noticing is generations are actually seemingly getting shorter, because technology and the speed of advancement and the change of events in the world speeds up the gap between people's perception and what shapes their worldview. But we see that my parents would have fallen into this range of 1965 to 1980. Not sure about you, where if that would be your parents as well. But this would be a lot of people. People were what's called moto-religious, right? There was really most people around this time were raised in Christian households with Christian values. There were a lot of things that they held at the center was like to be homogenous. You know what I mean? Like there was a lot of uniformity happening. There was authority and power held at a central standpoint, that the news was like all that you needed was the nightly news, and they told you everything that you would need. Every local authority was well respected, well trusted, and they were honored, you know what I mean, inside their communities. And to a big degree, the idol of the generation would have been religion, and faith would have been at the center. Faith would have been at the core. A lot of people's desire in those who were born in those years, growing up, their desire was to be a good moral person, based off of those Christian values, whether they claimed Christianity or not. The goal was, I want to be a good standing moral person. And so that's kind of like the America then, old America, Gen X America. And then we kind of had like this little shakeup in the millennial generation. And what made the millennials so different is that they grew up with all of the knowledge and upbringing of that old America. But by the time that they were all adults, they lived in all of the comfort of what Gen Z has known their whole lives. So they kind of have like all of this context of the old, but all the comfort of the new. And so with that, they became almost like this bridge generation that kind of like, they are kind of like holding the line between the young Gen Z and the older Gen X generations and boomers and beyond and behind. And so, they kind of grew up with this thing. For example, I don't know. Would you how old are you? Would you consider yourself a millennial, or would you kind of fit right into that millennial gap?
So I'm 29. I don't know. Well, turning 30 in a couple months, so I'm
So,
not
so
sure what.
maybe kind of in that maybe like I call myself the elder Gen Z. You know what I mean? That's what I refer to myself as. I'm gonna be 27
Elder
here
Gen Z.
soon. I refer to myself as like the elder Gen Z because I feel like there's so many like young Gen Z kids, and I'm like, I don't know what is going on with y'all, but I feel like we are not the same person.
Yeah.
But I do call myself the elder Gen Z. I feel like I'm kind of in that cusp. All my older millennial siblings call me a Zoomer, and then all my younger students, they're calling me an old head, like a millennial. And I'm like, I guess I feel like I'm in between. But for example, you may have grown up with a corded phone in your house, and especially, and a lot of millennials will relate to this, is you grow up with a corded phone in your house and you remember having to like go around the corner into the bathroom and close the door behind the cord so that people couldn't listen in on your conversation, and you'd have to yell at your siblings to get off the other line from listening on the other room on your conversation, all those things. And you remember that. You remember a corded phone, you remember a home phone. But when you were grown up, by the time you maybe were into your career or out of college or whatever that might have looked like, you never owned a corded phone in your life. Like you never owned your own with your own home phone number. Just wasn't a part of anything that you lived by. That's the best example that I know of to use for kind of like that millennial experience of growing up in all the context of old America and growing up with all the comfort of having a cell phone as an adult. You always had a cell phone. It was never a home phone. It was never a corded phone. It was never anything. It was just call me on my cell phone. And then we get to Gen Z, which is what would be my America or our America, the America we live in now. And even now, there's new studies coming out about Gen Alpha, which would be a lot of the 6th, 7th, and even some of the 8th graders who are beginning to be around. And so we're actually in a very unique time where we're seeing a lot of mixed generations in student ministry at one time, or even those cusp where we're seeing the transition over into Gen Alpha. But we have Gen Z. And something to understand about Gen Z is that for them, we get to now this new America where faith is at the margins. which is exactly what we talked about through Barna's recent studies. That's what we see, and it's proven through research. There's a lot of, where everything was very uniform in the old America. We see that there's a big pluralistic society, that, there's a lot of coexisting happening, or there's a lot of belief that we should all coexist, and there's a lot of multiple sources of authority, that, the nightly news is not, you can't trust the news, you can't trust the government, you can't trust them, you have to pull from everything, that people on Twitter and Instagram have just as much, and podcasters, you know what I mean, like we have just as much authority and information to give to people with the same amount of accreditation that the news does. And so, very different. Diversity in Gen Z is only noticed when it's absent. For us, diversity is a big thing, and we always remember, like, there's, and there's so many things where it's in commercials and in pictures and in all these different things. Like, you got to make sure there's a diverse crowd. There's got to make sure that the diversity is included. And Gen Z, they don't even really care about that, because the only time they notice is when it's not there, which is a really interesting thing when you start to understand their mindset of how they view the world. Like I said, everything's big open source, no trust in authority. That's where we get a lot of movements and activism. Comes from this idea that hey, authority can't hold you down, you know what I mean, and there's no one true thing, there's no one true source, and everything's very open. They're also a very frantic generation. The work week in the past 2 decades has moved from an average of 42-hour work weeks to now upwards of, some studies show, a 50-hour work week, depending on the cities and regions that we live in. And so, we live in a frantic society with a frantic work week. And where in the old America, their idol was to be a good moral person, you know what I mean, where their idol was religion or religious values. We see in this new generation that their idol is tolerance. The idea that if you disagree with my idea, that it is not only harmful to me, it's an act of violence against me. That if you disagree with something that I think, then you disagree with me. Me as who I am as a person, that you have a problem with me. And harm is no longer just this idea of something physical. Harm is the idea of anything that is against me, my ideas, my thoughts, my values, my beliefs, that it is harmful. And so, we get to this idea where their idol, what gets upheld in the world from them, is tolerance. That you must be tolerant of everything that everyone thinks. And so, people are finding themselves in this place where they're living somewhere between what they feel and what they want, like almost between, like, this idea of like hedonism and then like the religion of self, and they live somewhere between there. I wouldn't say that it's full, like we live in a fully hedonistic society, but we definitely see where it bleeds through. And so, but then there's also this idea of self, and you have to agree with me, and you have to understand my thing, you have to affirm me, and you have to, it's life revolves around me, you know what I mean, I am her. Some people don't see the big picture because they think they are the big picture. That's, the society we live in. And when we see that becomes the mindset of our generation, that's why I say that I believe Gen Z and even Gen Alpha are a mission field, because we're tackling a generation that has a worldview and a mindset and an understanding of the events that shape their life around them that is completely contrary to any generation that we've seen before them, that we've noticed or recorded or really tuned into. And so, that I like I said, try and keep it brief, but I think that's a good, just a roadmap of America that was before the millennial bridge generation. And something that's interesting about millennials too is even when I say the term millennial, I know you, and I know for myself even, and I'm sure people listening, is when you hear that, you have this stereotypical idea of what a millennial is in your head. People hear, oh, millennial, and I may ask you, like, do you feel like you're a millennial? And even if you fell into the age range and the demographic and the upbringing and the worldview, you would say, no, I'm not one of them, right? Because we think of millennial as like, the people who, we were told all these things by our parents. Hey, grow up, move out, get married, have kids. And, our idea of millennials, all these people who did everything contrary to that. They moved out, they had kids, and they moved back in. They live kind of with their grandparents or with their parents, but the kids don't get taken care of by the parents. They get taken care of by the aunts, uncles, and grandparents around them. And all these things of kind of this idea of a millennial in our head. of
Right.
what has been painted of a millennial. And so you have now this millennial generation that's split into two different paths. The millennials who are doing what their parents told them to do and moving out and getting married, having kids, living a life, finding a career, and then the millennials who aren't, and they're like diverging on two different paths. And so now we see those millennials having children and raising them under the two separate values, where now we have two generations. You're in the same generation, but you can't even identify yourself with your own generation because of the diverging worldviews that are happening within it. So it's
That
really
is
interesting. Um,
that is so interesting. It's yeah, I wonder if you said technology has a great part to play in this like
yeah,
rapid uptick and the generational changing.
yeah,
And social media is such a big, I mean, the youth is on social, everyone's on social media. I
mm-hmm,
don't know anyone who's really not.
yeah,
Um, Now, you brought up a lot, and a lot of like the worldviews. Tolerance is a big one, right? They
yeah,
identify themselves with their feelings, and that's something that I've talked about before. I feel like a lot of the youth, I feel like a lot of the youth, this is going to be ironic in a second,
yeah. I
are
know
led by
it's
their
always fun.
feelings. Yeah. They're led by their feelings. Their faith is led by their feelings, and their identity is led by their feelings. And, when I speak with the youth, the young adults group at our church and others, I say, if you root your whole foundation in feelings, your feelings are going to change. And then if your
Yep,
feelings change, then whatever it's based off of is going to change as well. And I
mm-hmm,
hope it's not your identity, because that has gone out the window, and that's
yep,
insanity.
yep,
So I think, feelings is a it's a good. I think our Pastor Kenneth says it's a great tool, but it's not a good compass.
yep.
It's not telling us where we should go.
It's a great
The
gauge, it's not a good guide. You know.
There we go.
Yep.
That's it right there. I do want to ask, how do you? Well, let me ask this first. Do you see, all of what you just said, which was awesome? Do you see that playing out in your students, in your group at church? Do you see it like, I don't, for lack of a better word, manifesting itself into the people, the kids that you lead?
Yeah, the worldview or kind of the shift or what I would like to see in my students. Like,
Probably the worldview.
yeah,
And I would pivot that to like questions that they ask or
mm-hmm,
things that they say. Are you like, oh, that's an interesting thing to say, or that's not very Christian, so to speak?
yeah.
Like I kind of know where that's coming from.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this generation, it goes back to kind of, your research that you brought up from Barna from the very beginning, is a lot of this generation, a lot of the questions that they ask about the Bible, um, I don't want to say they're not like deep or difficult questions, because some of them are. But I think more than anything, it begins to really show, they expose the worldview they do have. I think it's very exposing to the lives they do live. A lot of the questions are, well, on the topic of apologetics, are the thing of, hey, well, why can't we coexist? Well, why can't this happen? Or why is it the rule that this can't be this way? Why is it and a lot of their things just kind of expose. Now they're curious and they're asking clarifying questions, which I'm all for. But I think it does expose a lot of the worldview and mindset that they're in of, hey, well, I love my friend who's a member of the LGBTQ community, but why can't I support her in her lifestyle? Or why is that wrong? Like, I don't understand why that's wrong. And I think what it does more than anything is it shows where the struggle with the worldview begins to take place, and it affirms that is a tension that is being managed. I think the other thing it exposes is that a lot of the next generation just has a biblical illiteracy, and I don't think it starts with the next generation. I think it starts with a lot of previous generations, and we see that one of the scariest verses in the Bible for me is. I believe it's Judges 2:10, and it says, "And there grew a generation that did not know the Lord, did not know His word and His mighty works." And it's like the idea of teaching the next generation everything that we know about God, everything that is that we've learned about Jesus, everything that is that we've learned about His character and His promises, and being able to hand off the torch, so to speak. Um, and I think that previously it's been done poorly. And that's why we have a generation now that is so biblically illiterate that they're asking questions about, well, why is this? Because they don't even have any clue what the Bible says. And so for me, that's I think the two things that get exposed by it is, I think it affirms that there is a worldview problem, and it also exposes the fact that there is a lot of biblical illiteracy happening around it.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think, like you mentioned, apologetics has a significant role to play.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I teach on apologetics, I lead with, it is not necessary for salvation,
Mm-hmm.
but it is the
Yes.
closest thing to needed
Right.
that is possible in this
Yep.
generation, because
Yep.
these kids have questions. We just had not too long ago a lead pastor who he is an apologist. He used to work for Stand to Reason. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that
Yeah.
ministry, but
Mm-hmm.
he is now a lead pastor. And he says, he's like, as a pastor, you get all these questions. All of it's apologetics, problem of evil,
Mm-hmm.
homosexuality,
Yeah.
transgenderism. It's all apologetics that it comes down to. And he made a great point. He's like, his view is that the seminaries are failing the church
Mm-hmm.
because they're not teaching enough of apologetics.
Yep.
They're going a lot with leadership, which is great, but you also need that apologetic background to
Mm-hmm.
counter these issues because they are hard. Like, I understand where that student came to you and said, "Well, my friend is living this way. Why can't I support her?" And if only she knew, and you probably said this, but if only she knew that her friend was going into a fire, and for you to support that would be the most unloving thing,
Yeah.
right? Then that changes the whole dynamic of
Mm-hmm.
the conversation. So I think, yeah, apologetics is
Yep.
so necessary and so beneficial in today's culture because of, like you said, worldview and tolerance and all this stuff.
Yep. And I think it turns in, and then the other part of it, and I know I don't remember exactly how I answered that, but I think telling them like, hey, allowing people to live outside of God's best is not the best way to love them. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and some way of that. That's often how I kind of word it is like, hey, you are living outside of God's best and God's design and plan for your life. And if we would start to have our perception and our vantage point on that focus, we wouldn't just allow people to do whatever, you know what I mean, like they want. But the other thing is, also the biblical literacy side of it. It comes out that, hey, the Bible also says that the word is folly to those who don't believe. And so
Right.
it's, hey, the question becomes, is this person a proclaiming Christian who's living this way? If they are, then it is your duty and responsibility as a brother or sister in Christ to help pull them, like you said, pull them from that fire. You know what I mean? But if they're not, then your job is to love and show them the grace of Jesus so that they can know the love of the Father so that he can do the work he needs to do. You know what I mean? And it's like it's a multifaceted thing. And it's like, hey, you don't approve that behavior and say like, yeah, go do, you know what I mean, do whatever you want. It's like, it's not that, but it is learning how to show somebody the love that Jesus showed to all the sinners. You know what I mean? There was a reason why Jesus was just magnetic to the sinners and the unbelievers, because of his character. you know so
Yeah.
that's a big part of it, though.
Yeah. No, that's so good. Um, I wanted to ask too. So it seems like they're asking you questions, right? They're coming
Hmm.
to you, their worldview showing. Are you seeing an eagerness to seek spiritual truths from this generation, or are you seeing a more apathetic, oh, I'm going for the music, I'm going for the games, anything biblical, I'm not really too interested? Like, what are you seeing with your students as far as eagerness to seek?
Yeah, I think it's probably 50-50 right now. And I actually, I'm going to bring up this Barna study here,
Yeah.
where,
Good old
recently
Barna.
in good old Barna, and in 2021, they did a study of 1,000 US teens between the ages of 13, 17. And 50% of them, 52% of them, said they were extremely motivated to learn more about Jesus, and they were open to Jesus, open to learning more about Jesus and growing in their knowledge of who he is, and to have more aptitude and to spend more time. And so, and I feel like I can reflect and affirm that's kind of what I'm seeing, that there are a lot of students recently, and I think it's a lot of this younger kind of like that, like I said, that cusp of Gen Z almost headed into Gen Alpha, the young Gen Z, the young Zoomers, and so on, you know what I mean, and younger, who are almost, I think they're almost seeing their parents, older siblings, and the people who have gone before them living the life that they wanted to live, or that they thought they wanted to live, doing them kind of in that hedonistic religion of self, that self-centered hedonistic lifestyle, and they're seeing that a lot of them are now turning around and trying to figure out what to make of it, because all of that hasn't gotten them to the point that they desire, or gotten them to that point of joy or contentment that they can't find. And so I think the next generation has noticed how far over the pendulum swung this way, culturally, and they're looking for a way to say, hey, that's not working, I want something else, I want what they obviously aren't getting. And I think they're beginning to seek truth. And I think they also are growing up in a generation where, another piece of that generation is that they're, especially into Gen Alpha. A nickname that I've heard people give Gen Alpha is iGen. They're calling them iGen, because there's never been a time in their life where technology was not readily available at their disposal. Never. From the time they breathed their first breath outside the womb. Like, there has never been a time where technology has not been readily available in some way. In the NICU, in the nursing room, in the car ride home. Once they got, like, just everywhere.
Right.
It's like, you see, I see trends. I spend time around students, so I see a bunch of like trends on TikTok and stuff where you get like an older person and you're like, hey, show us how to like use a phone, and you're like this. We're all like this, and then you ask a kid how to do it, and they're like this.
No
Because they're used to
way.
hold it.
No
Yes.
way.
Yeah. Go ask your daughter. Hey,
Oh,
pretend like you're
yeah.
holding a phone right now, and she'll
She
do this,
might.
or she do
She
this.
might.
She
She,
hold it.
yeah, right. It's funny. I was talking to my father about that, how, we want to be pretty diligent of protecting her from the technology. And he was like, she's growing up in a world where it's all technology.
Hmm.
And I thought about that for a second. It is very interesting, but it just means that we need more diligent parents, right? We need
Yeah.
to be even more aware, even more looking out
Yeah.
for them, even more holding to a biblical worldview, even
Absolutely.
more doing that so we could
And it's hard
cultivate
because
the next.
you have to begin to balance that without weaponizing and demonizing the technology. Because
Right.
to them, and this is another thing, just with worldview, right? To us, millennials and prior, you know what I mean, or elder Gen Z and before, to us, technology is a part of the experience. It's part of what enhances the experience. It makes everything a little smoother, a little better. We enjoy technology in our things. We like going to the big IMAX theater. We like to, you know what I mean, like, we enjoy technology. We enjoy a good, whatever, whatever the technology is, we enjoy it.
Yeah.
But to Gen Z and Gen Alpha, technology is the experience. And
Mm.
so when you begin to, because again, it's encompassed and encased their livelihood. And so when we begin to weaponize and demonize the technology, we are trying to cut out a part of what they see as the experience and telling them that it's wrong. When to them, they're just saying, well, I just need to know how to utilize it. And so for us, it's just being more, like you said, more diligence, more oversight, more whatever, and just enhancing and or instilling that worldview better. You know what I mean? And helping to correct it to be a biblical worldview. Because there's a second, a worldview isn't bad, but there is a secular and a biblical worldview. And we have to decide, are we going to help to lean into that biblical worldview? And so I am always very careful to not, make technology a dirty word, or to make social media a dirty word, because there's not only bad that comes out of it, but to protect and to set the record straight that, hey, technology might be the experience, but it is not the end all be all, and it's not all good, and so kind of helping to gauge that narrative. But part of the reason they feel that way is because it has always been the experience. It's not a part of it, it is the whole thing. They've never had a moment where it wasn't ready. There's kids now who, if FaceTime isn't an option on the phone, they think the phone's broken. They think it doesn't work properly. Which is
I always
which
I,
we
I try to avoid FaceTime as much as possible, so my phone's always broken.
Yeah, yeah. But there are some kids who've grown up so much on FaceTime that if you hand them a phone and you just say, just talk to them like this, they're like, why isn't it working the right way?
Right.
Which is which we laugh at that. We're like, that's
Yeah.
ridiculous. And I think it is. I think that's crazy. But that's the worldview they have. That's something they've adopted as a belief system to them, that I should be able to see the person on the other side of the phone or the device at any given time.
Yeah. And now you said something, you don't want to throw technology under the bus, so to speak, right?
Yep.
Now, I'm interested to know, given the worldview of your students now, so the tolerance, let's
Hmm.
call it sensitivity, I think that's what it really
Yeah.
revolves around. How do you go about preaching the gospel of offense, because really the gospel is offensive, right? It's saying you are a sinner, you're no good, you can't be good, there is no good
Hmm.
without God, and you need him, and there's nothing you can do without God that's good. Now, how do you go about approaching the youth in that way, given the worldview differences?
Yeah, I think it's kind of two part. I think that a handful, like I said, there's right now recent studies have shown there's around 50% of them who are open and they're
Hmm.
seeking truth and looking for truth. Because I think there's a lot of the youth who is either watching, because everything is, they're watching something all the time, TikTok, YouTube, a streamer, a whatever, and I think they see, like, they're not. I mean, we have like the term, we think it's funny, brain rot. Like there's brain rot all over the next generation, right?
Yeah.
But I think they're more perceptive than sometimes we give them credit for. They're watching all these streamers, all these famous people, all these artists all the time. Just they're watching people just live their lives,
Yeah.
doing whatever, acting however, you know, living all these lavish lifestyles and doing all these things and being rich and famous. And they're seeing that those people still don't care, and I think they notice that. And I think there's a lot of students who, uh, there's another study I read that said that 38% of students say, of college age or younger currently, this was in 2022, said that they don't care about being rich and famous, that they want to live a life of contentment and a life of comfort and a life of happiness. That's what they want. So
Hmm.
almost 40% of the upcoming generation says that, hey, I don't care about being rich and famous. The goal is no longer to hit this echelon or this mark or this place in life, but it's almost like the idea of contentment and complacency, and hey, I want to make enough money to be comfortable and do whatever I want to do, and that's it. And if I can get that, then I'm fine. So I think it actually becomes a little bit easier to show them this thing of, hey, contentment and complacency, and well, not complacency, but contentment and, not happiness but joy, something that can't be shaken by outside and external things and circumstances around you, are only achievable through Jesus. And to be able to correct, I think it's giving students, and I think it applies, and I think there's some things where it's like we can talk about worldview, but I think there's some truths of the Bible that work no matter or not that work, but that are values and wells that are dug, that hold value no matter the age or no matter the person. I think all of us are
Oh yeah.
missing something. And I think the heart of it is knowing what is it that person is seeking, and then showing them how you can never find that absent of Jesus. And I think, we take the old generation. We preach to an older generation, talking about, they want to be good moral people. They want to be the right standing people in society. And, so we preach to that generation, telling them that, hey, you can be as good as you want, but being good doesn't get you to heaven. You know what I mean? Oh, it's only by the blood of Jesus. You know what I mean? It's only by the grace of the Father that we make it to heaven. And I think understanding the worldview and their internal belief and value, of what they desire for their life and things like that, are how we can learn how do we speak to them. And so, a lot of students who are, full of self, you know what I mean, and full of like this worldview of, it's about me, I'm all over all over this kind of thing. um I think for me it's always just provoking the question of, how's that going for you, you
Mm,
know
yeah.
because you're not, you can, I think there's a lot of students who have, and for better or, for whatever reason that God works the things in all ways for his good the way he does. There's a handful of students who are just maybe in the same boat we were, just curious and just looking for more, and they're seeking that truth. And what is this truth? What is it? It's the same thing we see in John 18 with Pilate, that he was saying, what is, and he's like, is this true? He's asking Jesus, is this true that you're the king of the Jews? And Jesus asks him, he says, what is that you believe is true? And Pilate asks him back, he says, well, what is truth?
Right.
And so I think that's the question that these students are looking for. But I think there's another set of students who are saying, hey, I'm trying everything. I'm in high school. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I'm going here. I'm going there. I'm at this party with my friends. I'm at this party with this girl. They're trying all of these things, and and I'm sure that we wish they weren't. But there's a lot of students who are seeking whatever it is to find fulfillment. To can me doing everything I think I want and everything that I think is fulfilling to me, and then discovering, well, it's still leaving something to be desired for me, and being able to catch students. I think that the world around them and the worldview they've adopted, and I hate to say this, but it's set them up to fail. um, Genuinely, the worldview they've adopted has set them up to fail. And again, like I said, I hate to say this, but when with them being so set up to fail, it sets us up to catch them. It sets us up, and I it sounds almost like I want them to fail, and because that's where we get them. And I hate that it sounds like that, but really, when students are and just even younger people, a lot of Gen Z now is my age, and 22 and 23, and they're in college and things and entering the workforce. But as the world begins to let them down, we can catch them and show them what true fulfillment is. And we know that's only found in a relationship with Jesus. And where they think it's following every desire their heart has and everything their emotions are telling them, and always coming back to this place of, but that wasn't it. But that didn't give me what I wanted. But that didn't leave me feeling fulfillment. That didn't leave, whatever the thing may be on the other side of it. It set them up to fail, but it sets us up to lead them so well. And I think that's just where we can catch them.
Right. Well, that's very helpful. It's a great answer. I think, in that Truthful Hope, the ministry that we have going on here is it's all about reaching the hopeless, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
without Christ, like you mentioned, there is no hope. It's just
Yeah.
despair. And they try and put it in places like sex, money, drugs, whatever it is, and it'll never do it in the long
Yep.
term. The fear that comes though on the backside of that is you have these, and I should back up and say at Truthful Hope,
Mm-hmm.
we try and reach them with reason, and that's where apologetics comes in. So we notice and identify the feeling of hopelessness, and we want to play into that with reason. And the
Yep.
reason for that is because there's so many false teachers out
Yep.
there that will take their hopelessness, abandon reason, and say, "Oh, let me prey on that. Let me give you what you want, what
Mm-hmm.
sounds like you want. Oh, if 50% of you are seeking Jesus, Jesus was a mythical spirit, Christ consciousness type of guy who only wants you to be happy. Love is love. Do what you need to do." So many people preach that, and it's attracting because it's like, oh, I could keep Jesus, I could keep my church, and I could support my friends who are going down the wrong path and do whatever I want. This is incredible. Like, this is great. I love that. I'm no longer hopeless. But that's where truth comes in, right? Because you might not feel hopeless now, but if it's against the truth, you will be hopeless. Like, it's eternal damnation. There's a sacrifice here, and that's why I think reason is so important. And pastors like yourself who are going on these pulpits and preaching to these kids. So it's incredibly. We have to be so careful, right, with
Yeah.
how much we emphasize feeling and reason. And a lot of people see them as two separate parts, but really they're one.
They're actually two very. They're much closer than people think,
Yeah.
and they're very different. Like let me. I realize that sounds like I'm like, yeah, they're kind of they're very different. I think they're both filters. Reason and emotions are both filters that people use, and I think where sometimes we go wrong here is we see reason as like not a filter but like an absolute thing, and then we see emotion as like, well, that's not real. But the reality is there's so many things where it's like you have God, and then there's reason and logic and emotion and experience and all these things. And we've a lot of times people will filter their belief in God through all these things first. So they go through their emotions, through their experiences, past and present, through traditions, whether it's in the church or in their family, and then through reason and logic, and then they come to the conclusion of who God is. And instead, what our goal is, you know what I mean, and what our goal is, not just for the next generation, but for followers of Jesus, is to help people see, hey, we start with God and we allow Him to speak into our idea of logic and reason and our traditions and our emotions and our experiences, and to determine what those are, rather than the other way around. Um, and something you said just a minute ago as you were talking is you're saying they're looking for like some kind of they're looking for that experience. Something that I actually just saw recently is, do you know what the number one, I don't want to say religion, but like growing interest, or like fad is for Gen Z right now? As far as like religious, it's kind of in the realm of religion
Would it be
and
New Age? That'd be my guess.
so new age things, so witchcraft, right? Witchcraft, crystals, astrology. Pew Research did a study in 2017, so it's a little bit dated, but that would be right in the heart of Gen Z, and it indicated that 60% of Americans believe in psychics, astrology, and the presence of spiritual energy in inanimate objects, about a broader spectrum of spirituality. 60%. So that's not just, that's Christians and non-Christians alike. But almost 2/3 of America believes that to be a fact, that that's true. Um, and so there, but I've kind of, I was talking with a pastor friend recently, and we've come to the conclusion that the conclusion decisively, but our thought and idea is that students are seeking, and not just students, but this whole generation, the older ones a little younger than me, as well as a lot of the younger ones, it's the number one, witchcraft is the number one, like I don't know if it's a religion, pagan tradition, paganism, whatever, that's on the rise. It's the greatest thing on the rise, and we believe that it's because students are seeking a spiritual experience, and they don't know how else to feel it, or where else to get it, or what it should look like. And everybody's telling them, and that's where we get like this thing of, well, if you're not feeling it, then it must not be real. And so and so they're practicing and digging into this thing. And now on TikTok there's witch talk, which is like,
Oh,
TikTok has all these different like subcategories, like a Reddit thread. But and there's witch talk, where you can, if you get your filters right, you can end up on witch talk, and set your algorithm whatever, where it's all over the place. It's a big hashtag, like 11 million hashtags a month and something like that. But it's
so I
crazy
should
that
post my apologetics content on the Witch Talk. Is that what you're saying?
ooh, that's good. I like that. Yeah, they're not gonna know what hit them.
Yeah, right.
Um, but no, like that's the number one thing. And we believe that it's because they're looking for a spiritual experience, and we have to be the ones to set the record straight of what does that look like. What is the true definition of a spiritual experience? You know what I mean? Like, and showing them like any moment with God is a spiritual experience. That we are we're triune. That we are spiritual beings. We don't need to seek something that was never intended. You know what I mean? For our spirit to connect with, because we know it's demonic. You know what I mean? Like, we know it's not something that God intended for us. You know what I mean? But showing them um, how it's not the same. And I think a lot of that secular worldview of coexistence, and well, questions of aren't isn't it all the same God? Well, all these different religions pray to God. Isn't it all the same God? And all these different questions like that. Recently I've preached to my students about just the idea of like Colossians 2, where it says, hey, don't get caught up in like the nonsense religions that are around you and the nonsense beliefs. Um, and there's a lot of things competing for their attention and competing for their mindset and competing for their worldview. And so I think it's important now more than ever to really be able to streamline and say, hey, and to be unified in that thing. Going back to the original research of Worldview, that only 4% are practicing and following a biblical worldview. It's like we need to be unified as the church, to be unified in this. In John, we see that Jesus said, it's by your unity that the world will know that you are my disciples. And so it's like, if the majority is ununified on that belief, then we have a long ways to go.
That's that's so good, and I think that's the call to action right there,
Yep.
right? It's to not shun them, it's not
Right.
to reprimand them, so to speak, but it's to come
Right.
alongside them. And maybe that's what the church has been missing with this repent
Mm-hmm.
and believe and Bible thumping, and homosexuality is wrong, but the way that the church has gone about it for so long has also not been right. So,
Right.
and that hasn't
Exactly.
helped anybody. And I think we need
And
to come alongside these kids.
I think it comes from, and I think there's part, and just to be fair, I think there's part of the church's world, the big C church. I think there's a part of, you know, the church, and we're all flawed people who are trying to do our best to follow the call that God has placed on all of us as believers. But I think we have, like you said, done a really bad job of following that and of setting the example. And I think our approach has been very poor at um, helping to love the people into, for lack of better terms, like love them into submission to Jesus. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
we've done a poor job of that. And I think I think that also comes from a flawed worldview of, of how we should act and how we should behave. And so I think there's a worldview that the world has adopted that we need to correct, but there's part of our worldview as the church that needs to be corrected and refocused and fixed, so that we can do better at reaching those who are lost. And as we, do a good job of, helping to bring the one of the 99, leave those 99 to find the one, get them in the doors, get them, around Jesus, you know what I mean, and submitted to him. And then it's just having, I think the call to action too is to have a clear path forward. Hey, when somebody, and it's hard because there's we've all been lost at one point. At some point, all of us were lost. And I think for us, we have all undergone this process of, Romans 12:2, do not be conformed, but transform yourself, transform your mind by the renewing of the word. You know what I mean? And so, I think we've all gone through a process that to us has become subconscious of reshaping, re-narrating the worldview that we've lived in for so long. There was a time in my life, and I'm sure there's a time in your life, where the worldviews we carried were not biblical worldviews, and we've had to learn and relearn and edit, and and that's been a process. And I think for us, it's being able to put words to that, and being able to put behavior to that, and being able to put belief to that, and statements to that, and scripture to that, and to be able to help teach people that, hey, I just got saved, now what? And really being able to do that, like renovation of a worldview, like renovate that worldview from secular to biblical, and to help know the journey we're taking people on.
Right. No, that's so good. I thought this was great, Pastor Lucas.
Yeah,
We are coming to the end here, but I think
yeah,
we got to have
absolutely.
you back on for a part two, because there is
Yeah,
a
I'd love to
lot
have a part two.
more to unpack with worldviews in the church. And like I said, it's one of, if not the most important topic, right? Because we're talking about the future of the church, the present of the church, and the future of the church. So it's
Mm-hmm.
twofold. And like
Yep.
you said, we've done a lot of wrong. The only real way that we can remedy that is to fix the youth so that they don't
Mm-hmm.
make the same mistakes, right? And
Absolutely.
so I am very much looking forward to having you on part two. Thank you so much for joining, Pastor Lucas. It's been an honor to just chat with you about this.
Yeah, it's been great. I look forward to talking some more. Thanks for having me on. I'm glad that we could just, even just to be able to have an initial conversation of how did we get here? What did the road look like? And there's so much in between that we didn't get to talk about. But maybe in part two we can just even begin to put action to those things of how can we as followers of Jesus begin to correct that narrative. So I'm looking forward to being able to talk with you more. Thank you again for having me on.
Of course, part two coming. Our listeners heard it here first. Thank you guys for joining. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next time.